Imagine you wake up tomorrow morning and every single news alert on your phone is screaming the same thing at the same time. Not one story, not two, eight. Eight simultaneous military events erupting across the Middle East in a single night, all traced back to one origin point, all calculated, all deliberate, and all designed to send a message so loud that no government on earth could pretend they didn't hear it. That is the scenario we are about to walk through, not as fantasy, not as fear-mongering, but as a serious, unflinching geopolitical war game. Because the question of what Iran could theoretically do if it decided to abandon restraint entirely and go to full escalation is not a fringe question anymore. It is a question that military strategists, intelligence agencies, and defense ministers across the Western world have been modeling in classified rooms for years. Tonight, we are going to model it together, and what you are about to hear is going to fundamentally change the way you think about the balance of power in the 21st century. To understand what a full-scale Iranian retaliation scenario would look like, you first have to understand something that most mainstream coverage gets completely wrong. Iran is not a reckless actor. Iran is a patient one. For over 4 decades, the Islamic Republic has absorbed assassinations of its scientists, covert sabotage of its nuclear facilities, economic strangulation through sanctions, and the killing of its most celebrated military commander on foreign soil. In every single one of those moments, Iran responded, but always calibrated, always measured, always just enough to signal capability without triggering a war it did not want to fight that day. The entire architecture of Iranian strategic doctrine is built around the concept of the long game. Strike when it costs the enemy more than it costs you. Wait until the moment is right, and when that moment comes, do not punch once, punch everywhere, all at once before the enemy can reorient. That doctrine, sometimes called the octopus strategy inside Iranian military planning circles, is the foundation of the scenario we are examining tonight. 8 attacks, 8 different vectors, 8 different targets, launched within the same operational window so that American and Israeli command structures are simultaneously flooded with crisis data they cannot process fast enough to respond coherently. The goal is not necessarily to win a conventional war in the traditional sense. The goal is to impose a cost so enormous, so public, and so psychologically devastating that the political will for further confrontation collapses before a counterattack can even be organized. This is asymmetric warfare elevated to a geopolitical art form. And if you think Iran lacks the capability to execute something like this, you have not been paying close enough attention. Let's begin with the maritime dimension because the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz are where the entire global economy becomes a hostage in this scenario. Approximately 21% of the world's traded oil passes through that narrow channel every single day. In this hypothetical, the opening move of Iran's 8-strike campaign targets commercial shipping with a precision and aggression never seen before. 3 oil tankers are struck in rapid succession using a combination of naval drone swarms and subsurface limpet mines pre-positioned by Iranian Revolutionary Guard naval units operating under commercial cover. The tankers do not sink immediately. They are set ablaze deliberately because a burning tanker is not just a logistics disruption. It is a television event. It is a visual so visceral and so destabilizing that crude oil futures spike 40% within hours. Every refinery in Europe, every fuel depot in Asia, every gas station in the American Midwest feels the ripple of those 3 burning ships before the fires are even extinguished. But here is what makes this scenario so strategically terrifying. While the world's cameras are pointed at the burning tankers in the Gulf, Iran's second and third strike packages are already in flight. In this scenario, a forward operating base housing American military personnel in the region is struck by a coordinated barrage of precision-guided ballistic missiles. These are not the crude, unguided rockets of a proxy militia. These are domestically produced Iranian ballistic systems. The Fateh 313, the Zulfiqar, weapons with circular error probabilities tight enough to thread a missile through a specific building on a specific base. The base's crammed defense systems, counter-rocket artillery, and mortar batteries successfully intercept a portion of the incoming volley, but in a saturation attack designed to overwhelm point defense, some missiles get through. Infrastructure is destroyed, casualties mount, and the American military, for the first time in a generation, is forced to confront the reality that its forward presence in the region is not invulnerable. That distance and deterrence are not the same thing. In this war game, the casualty figures from that strike trigger an immediate political earthquake in Washington. The death of American service members on a foreign base at the hands of a direct Iranian military action, not a proxy, not a militia, but the Iranian state itself, crosses a threshold that no administration can manage quietly. The pressure to respond is enormous. But here is where Iran's timing becomes the most dangerous variable of all, because the scenario does not pause to let Washington catch its breath. While the National Security Council is still convening its first emergency session, the fourth and fifth strike packages execute. The fourth strike in this scenario targets intelligence infrastructure. In the world of covert operations, Iran has spent decades building a detailed map of CIA and Mossad operational architecture in the region: safe houses, communication relays, the human networks that sustain Western intelligence presence across the Middle East. In this hypothetical, a series of coordinated operations, some kinetic, some electronic, some executed through Iranian proxy intelligence networks, simultaneously compromise multiple nodes of that infrastructure. Senior intelligence officers operating in the region are exposed, extracted, or eliminated. Station chiefs go dark. Communication channels that took years to build are severed in a single night. The intelligence blackout that follows is, in many ways, more strategically damaging than any physical strike, because it blinds the very people responsible for telling the President of the United States what is actually happening on the ground. The fifth strike goes after the technological crown jewel of American and Israeli air defense, the THAAD system. Terminal High-Altitude Area Defense is one of the most sophisticated anti-ballistic missile platforms ever built. It is also, like every weapon system ever constructed, not infinitely scalable. In this scenario, Iran executes a feint, a decoy launch profile designed to drain THAAD interceptor inventory, followed almost immediately by the real attack package, hitting the battery from a vector and at an altitude that the system's radar geometry is least prepared to handle. Whether the strike fully destroys the battery or simply renders it temporarily non-operational matters less than what the world sees on satellite imagery the following morning: a crater where one of America's most advanced defense systems used to stand. The psychological signal that sends to every American ally in the region is beyond calculation. The sixth element of this scenario involves air power, which is the domain where American military supremacy is most deeply assumed and most psychologically embedded in the public consciousness. In this war game, an American combat aircraft, a fixed-wing fighter bomber on a patrol mission, is engaged and downed by an Iranian air defense system operating in contested airspace. Iran's domestically developed air defense network, built painstakingly over decades in direct response to Western sanctions that prevented conventional arms purchases, is more capable than most Western analysts have been willing to publicly acknowledge. The downing of an American aircraft is not just a military event, it is a symbolic rupture. For 2 generations, the image of American air power as untouchable has been one of the foundational pillars of U.S. deterrence in the region. The moment that image fractures, even once, the entire deterrence architecture starts to crack. And then comes the seventh element, the one that in this scenario forces every naval officer and defense planner to confront their worst professional nightmare. The USS Abraham Lincoln, or a carrier of equivalent class positioned in the scenario in the northern Arabian Sea as part of a surge deployment, is targeted by a coordinated ballistic missile strike. 4 missiles, launched from multiple platforms to complicate intercept geometry. The carrier's defensive systems, the Aegis combat system, the standard missile interceptors, the last-ditch CIWS cannons, engage every incoming round with everything they have. In this hypothetical, not all of them are successful. 1 missile impacts. The damage to the carrier is significant but not catastrophic. The carrier does not sink. But a United States Navy aircraft carrier has been struck by a hostile ballistic missile in combat conditions, and that single fact changes the strategic calculus of every Navy in the world from that moment forward. Because the carrier is the symbol, it is the floating embodiment of American global power projection, and it has just been hit. The eighth and final element of the scenario is perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated of all, because it is not a physical strike, it is a declaration. In this war game, within hours of all 7 kinetic events unfolding, Iranian leadership issues a formal strategic communication, not to the United Nations, not through diplomatic back channels, but directly to the world through a broadcast address carried simultaneously on Iranian state media and distributed in full through every international outlet that picks it up. The message is precise, controlled, and chilling in its deliberateness. Iran declares that what the world witnessed that night was not the beginning of a war. It was a demonstration of capability. It was proof that every American military asset in the region, every intelligence network, every defensive system, every ship, every aircraft, every forward base, all of it exists within range and within reach. And then comes the line that burns itself into the global consciousness. This region, Iran declares, will be a graveyard for any invader who mistakes patience for weakness. Part 2, 1700 words. What happens in the 72 hours after the scenario we just described is in many ways more important than the strikes themselves. Because this is where the war game becomes a masterclass in the terrifying complexity of modern escalation dynamics, and where the assumptions that have governed Western strategic thinking for the past 30 years get stress-tested to their absolute breaking point. The immediate American military response to a scenario of this magnitude would be constrained by factors that rarely get discussed in public discourse. The United States military is extraordinarily powerful, but it is not omnipotent, and it is not infinitely resilient in the face of simultaneous multi-domain shocks. The loss of the intelligence network disrupted in the fourth strike means that the targeting data needed to execute a precise retaliatory strike campaign is degraded. Launching a massive retaliatory strike against Iran with degraded intelligence does not just risk civilian casualties, it risks hitting the wrong targets entirely, potentially striking sites that the U.S. believes are military but which Iran has deliberately seeded with civilians or international observers in anticipation of exactly this scenario. Every bomb that falls on the wrong target is a propaganda victory for Tehran. Every civilian casualty is a recruitment poster. The international coalition dimension of this scenario is equally paralyzing. The moment Iran strikes American targets directly, U.S. allies and NATO are confronted with the most consequential Article 5 question since the alliance was founded. Does an Iranian attack on U.S. forces in the Middle East trigger collective defense obligations? The answer is almost certainly no in strict legal terms, but the political pressure is enormous and it fractures the alliance at precisely the moment when unity is most needed. European capitals, already managing energy crises amplified by the Gulf shipping disruption, are being pulled between solidarity with Washington and the catastrophic economic consequences of a full-scale regional war that would close the Strait of Hormuz indefinitely. China and Russia in this scenario do not intervene militarily. They do not need to. They simply watch and wait and veto every Security Council resolution that might legitimize a coordinated international response. Their diplomatic obstruction is not an act of war. It is an act of strategic patience that mirrors Iran's own doctrine. Every day that passes without a clean, internationally endorsed American military response is a day that Iran's narrative, that it acted in self-defense against imperial aggression, gains more traction in the global south, across the Arab street, across the Muslim world, and across every population that has spent decades watching American military power operate in the region without consequence. Inside the United States, the domestic political pressure is volcanic. The images from the burning tankers, the struck base, the downed aircraft, and the damaged carrier are playing on loop across every screen in the country. The demand for a decisive response is bipartisan and immediate, but the architects of American grand strategy are staring at a decision tree with no clean branches. A massive air campaign against Iran risks a ground war that the American public, exhausted after 2 decades of Middle Eastern conflict, has no appetite to sustain. A limited strike risks looking weak and inviting further Iranian escalation. A naval blockade risks being legally challenged and physically contested. And doing nothing, or appearing to do nothing, risks a collapse of American deterrence credibility so severe that every American ally in the Pacific, in Eastern Europe, and across the Middle East begins quietly accelerating their own nuclear hedging strategies. This is the strategic trap at the heart of the scenario, and it is the reason that serious defense analysts lose sleep over it. Iran does not need to defeat the United States militarily. Iran needs to demonstrate that the cost of confronting Iran directly is too high, too unpredictable, and too politically unsustainable to be worth paying. The 8-strike scenario, if executed with the discipline and precision this war game imagines, does not win Iran a war. It wins Iran a negotiation. It forces Washington to the table not from a position of strength and dominance, but from a position of exhausted calculation, a recognition that the era of costless power projection in the Persian Gulf is over. For Israel, the implications of this scenario are existential in the most immediate sense. The destruction of a THAAD battery, the compromise of regional intelligence networks, and the demonstration of Iranian ballistic missile accuracy against hardened targets strips away the layered air defense architecture that forms the backbone of Israeli security strategy. Israel's own Iron Dome, David's Sling, and Arrow systems are extraordinarily capable, but they are finite. They can be saturated. They were designed for specific threat profiles. And in this scenario, Iran has just demonstrated publicly that it understands those profiles in granular detail and has engineered its attack packages specifically to exploit their limitations. The Israeli government in this wargame faces a population that is terrified, a military that is recalibrating in real time, and an American ally that is simultaneously dealing with its own crisis and cannot give Israel its full attention or its full resources. The energy markets in this scenario do not recover quickly. The Strait of Hormuz, even without a formal closure, becomes a war zone that no commercial insurer in the world will cover at a rate that makes transit economically rational. Tanker traffic collapses. Oil prices reach levels that trigger recession conditions in every import-dependent economy on Earth. The global inflation shock that follows is not measured in months, it is measured in years. And every population that experiences fuel poverty, food inflation, and economic contraction as a result of this conflict becomes a political variable that their governments cannot control. Governments that will be under massive public pressure to end the conflict at any cost, even if that cost is accepting an outcome favorable to Tehran. What the scenario ultimately reveals is not that Iran is more powerful than the United States. It is not. What it reveals is that the architecture of American dominance in the Middle East was always more fragile than it appeared, built on the assumption that no adversary would ever be willing to pay the price of direct confrontation, and on the assumption that if they did, the response options would be clean, fast, and decisive. Neither assumption survives contact with the eight-strike war game. The price Iran pays in this scenario, the retaliatory strikes, the economic pressure, the international isolation, is enormous. But Iran has spent 40 years being told that the price of defiance is too high, and in this hypothetical, it has decided that the price of continued submission is higher still. The final lesson of this scenario is the one that makes it genuinely dangerous to ignore. Military conflicts in the 21st century are not decided purely on the battlefield. They are decided in the information space, in the economic space, in the political space, and in the patience of populations. Iran in this war game has studied every one of those spaces with a thoroughness and a sophistication that its adversaries have consistently underestimated. The eight strikes are not just military operations. They are communication events, economic weapons, political instruments, and psychological operations, all firing simultaneously in a single coordinated package, designed not to destroy American power but to exhaust American will. Whether this scenario ever becomes reality depends on decisions being made right now in Tehran, in Washington, in Tel Aviv, and in every capital that has a stake in whether the Persian Gulf remains a space of managed tension or tips into something far more catastrophic. The diplomats, the strategists, and the intelligence services working those problems deserve more credit than they typically receive, because the fact that scenarios like this one remain hypothetical is not an accident. It is the result of continuous, exhausting, largely invisible work to prevent the conditions that would make a night of eight strikes feel like the only option left on the table. But the work is never finished. The tensions are never fully resolved. And the question of what happens if the calculations change, if deterrence fails, if patience runs out, if the wrong decision gets made at the wrong moment, that question does not go away just because we choose not to look at it directly. Tonight, we looked at it directly, and if nothing else, what we have seen should leave us with a profound and urgent appreciation for just how much depends on the next conversation, the next negotiation, the next diplomatic opening, being handled with the seriousness and the care that the stakes demand, because the alternative is not a war that anyone wins. It is a war that everyone loses, in fire, in blood, in treasure, and in the slow, grinding collapse of an international order that, for all its imperfections, has been the fragile framework keeping the worst possibilities at bay. That is what is at stake. That is what the eight-strike scenario in the end is really about.